The Red Death had long devastated the country.
Once
No
upon a
pestilence had
midnight's
ever been
dream,
so fleeting.
while I
With a
listened
feeling
to
of deep, yet
over
most
many
For
For the
points
most
of
wild,
curiosity,
yet most
forgotten
homely story which I am about to tell.
It was many and many a year ago,
In
a kingdom
true. Nervous, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am.
Yet mad.
But why will he say that I am mad?
Very surely do I not.
The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed.
To be buried while alive is beyond question the most terrific of extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. Once upon a midnight's dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate's dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here, forevermore.
With a feeling of deep, yet most singular affection, I regarded my friend, Morella. Thrown by accident into her society many years ago, my soul from our first meeting burned with fires it had never before known. We met, and fate bound us together at the altar. And I never spoke of passion, nor thought of love. She, however, shunned society, and attaching herself to me alone, rendered me happy. It is a happiness to wonder. It is a happiness to dream. Morella's erudition was profound. As I hoped to live, her talents were of no common order. Her powers of mind were gigantic. I felt this, and in many matters became her pupil. I soon, however, found that, perhaps on account of her Pressburg education, she placed before me a number of those mystical writings, which I usually considered the mere dross of the early German literature. These, for what reason I could not imagine, were her favorite and constant study, and that in process of time they became my own. I abandoned myself implicitly to the guidance of my wife and entered with an unflinching heart into the intricacies of her studies. And then when poring over forbidden pages, I felt a forbidden spirit enkindling within me. Would Morella place her cold hand upon my own and wake up from the ashes of a dead philosophy some low, singular words whose strange meaning burned themselves in upon my memory. And then, hour after hour would I linger by her side and dwell upon the music of her voice, until at length its melody was tainted with terror, and there fell a shadow upon my soul, and I grew pale and shuddered inwardly at those two unearthly tones. And thus, joy suddenly faded into horror, and the most beautiful became the most hideous. The time had now arrived when the mystery of my wife's manner oppressed me as a spell. I could no longer bear the touch of her worn fingers, nor the low tone of her musical language, nor the luster of her melancholy eyes. And she knew all this, but did not upbraid. She seemed conscious of my weakness or my folly, and smiling, called it fate. She seemed also conscious of a cause, to me unknown, for the gradual alienation of my regard, but she gave me no hint or token of its nature. Yet was she woman, and pined away daily. In time, the crimson spot settled steadily upon the cheek, and the blue veins upon the pale forehead became prominent. And in one instant, my nature melted into pity, but in next, I met the glance of her meaning eyes, and my soul sickened and became giddy with the giddiness of one who gazes downward into some dreary and unfathomable abyss. Shall I then say that I longed with an earnest and consuming desire for the moment of Morella's decease? I did, but I grew furious through delay, and with the heart of a fiend cursed the days and the nights and the bitter moments which seemed to lengthen and lengthen as her gentle life declined, like shadows in the dying of the day. One autumn evening, when the winds lay still in heaven, Morella called me to her bedside. There was a dim mist over all the earth, and a warm glow upon the waters. And amid the rich October leaves of the forest, a rainbow from the firmament had surely fallen. "It is a day of days," she said as I approached. "A day of all days, either to live or die. It is a fair day for the sons of earth and life, more fair for the daughters of heaven and death." I kissed her forehead, and she continued, "I am dying, yet shall I live." "Morella, the days have never been when thou couldst love me, but her whom in life thou didst abhor, in death thou shalt adore." "Morella, I repeat, I am dying, but within me is a pledge of that affection, how little which thou didst feel for me, Morella. And when my spirit departs, shall the child live, thy child and mine, Morella's. But thy days shall be days of sorrow, that sorrow which is the most lusting of impressions, as the cypress is the most enduring of trees. For the hours of thy happiness are over." "Morella," I cried, Morella, how knowest thou this? But she turned away her face upon the pillow, and a slight tremor coming over her limbs, she thus died. And I heard her voice no more. As she had foretold, her child, to which in dying she had given birth, which breathed not until the mother breathed no more, her child, a daughter, lived, and the child grew strangely in stature and intelligence, and was the perfect resemblance of her who had departed. And I loved her with a love more fervent than I had believed it possible to feel for any denizen of earth. But ere long, the heaven of this pure affection became darkened, and gloom and horror and grief swept over it in clouds. I said the child grew strangely in stature and intelligence. Strange indeed was her rapid increase in bodily size, but terrible, oh, terrible were the tumultuous thoughts which crowded upon me while watching the development of her mental being. Could it be otherwise when I daily discovered in the conceptions of the child the adult powers and faculties of the woman? When the lessons of experience fell from the lips of infancy? When I say all this became evident to my appalled senses, when I could no longer hide it from my soul, nor throw it off from those perceptions which trembled to receive it? Is it to be wondered at that suspicions of a nature fearful and exciting crept in upon my spirit, or that my thoughts fell back aghast upon the wild tales and thrilling theories of the entombed? Morella. As years rolled away and I gazed day after day upon her holy and mild and eloquent face, day after day did I discover new points of resemblance in the child to her mother, the melancholy and the dead. And hourly grew darker these shadows of similitude, and more full, and more definite, and more perplexing, and more hideously terrible in their aspect. For that her smile was like Morella's I could bear, but then I shuddered at its too perfect identity. That her eyes were like Morella's I could endure, but then they too often looked down into the depths of my soul with Morella's own intense and bewildering meaning, and in the contour of the high forehead, and in the ringlets of the silken hair, and in the worn fingers which buried themselves therein, and in the sad musical tone of her speech, but above all, above all, in the phrases and the expressions of the dead on the lips of the loved and the living. As yet, my daughter remained nameless upon the earth. My child and my love were the designations usually prompted by a father's affection, and the rigid seclusion of her days precluded all other intercourse. Morella's name died with her at her death. Of the mother I had never spoken, to the daughter it was impossible to speak. Indeed, during the brief period of her existence, the latter had received no impressions from the outward world, save such as might have been afforded by the narrow limits of her privacy. But at length, the ceremony of baptism presented to my mind, in its unnerved and agitated condition, a present deliverance from the terrors of my destiny and at the baptismal font I hesitated for a name, and many titles of the wise and beautiful, of old and modern times, of my own and foreign lands came thronging to my lips, with many, many fair titles of the gentle and the happy and the good. What prompted me then to disturb the memory of the buried dead? What demon urged me to breathe that very sound which in its recollection was wont to make ebb the purple blood in torrents from the temples to the heart? What fiend spoke from the recesses of my soul when amid those dim aisles and in the silence of the night I whispered within the ears of the holy man the syllables, Morella? What more than fiend convulsed the features of my child and overspread them with hues of death, as starting at that scarcely audible sound, she turned her glassy eyes from the earth to heaven, and falling prostrate upon the black slabs of our ancestral vault, responded, I am here! Distinct, coldly, calmly distinct, fell those few simple words within my ear, and thence, like molten lead, rolled hissingly into my brain. Years may pass away, but the memory of that epoch never. And I kept no reckoning of time or place, and the stars of my fate faded from heaven, and therefore the earth grew dark, and its figures passed by me like flitting shadows, and among them all I beheld only Morella. The winds of the firmament breathed but one sound within my ear, and the ripples upon the sea murmured evermore, Morella. But she died. And with my own hands I bore her to the tomb, and laughed with a long and bitter laugh as I found no traces of the mother in the sepulchre where I laid the second. Morella.
And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, 'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. That it is, and nothing more. Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here, I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore!
Merely this,
And
nevermore.
For the most wild, yet most homely story which I am about to tell, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, and have destroyed me. To me, they have presented little but horror. From my infancy, I was noted for the kindness of my disposition. I was especially fond of animals and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. I married early and was happy to find in my husband a disposition not unlike my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, he lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. And speaking of his intelligence, my husband made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him and he attended me wherever I went about the house. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my spouse. At length, I even offered him personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, but my disease grew upon me. For what disease is like alcohol? And at length, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him. In his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, filled every fibre of my frame. I took a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder while I recount the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with morning, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse. But I again plunged into excess and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then the spirit of perverseness. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to do the wrong for the wrong's sake only that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the cat. One morning, in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin. A deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my husband, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. Our entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls had fallen in, with one exception, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with a very minute and eager attention. The words, strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw the figure of a gigantic cat. There was a rope about the animal's neck. First beheld this apparition, my wonder and my terror were extreme. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal and to look about me for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat in an infamous den, my attention was drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search for. I at once offered to purchase it from the landlord, but he had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal accompanied me. It became immediately a great favorite with my husband. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it rising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but by slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my husband. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, and let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. My husband had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken. You'll remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible endure of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. Neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter, I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. One day, my husband accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proven instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my husband, goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal. I withdrew my arm from his grasp and buried the axe in his brain. He fell dead upon the spot without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house either by day or by night without the risk of being observed. Many projects entered my mind. At one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. I had no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation, I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while with little trouble I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. Yes, slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again, I breathed freely. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the 4th day after the assassination, the police came unexpectedly into the house and proceeded to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the 3rd or 4th time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered, not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. "Gentlemen," I said, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. By the way, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls... Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane that had been leaning against the wall, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of my husband. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk to silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman. Howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the officers remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb!
Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, where thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but, with the mien of a lord or lady, perched himself just above my chamber door, perched, and sat, and nothing more. Any bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," said I, "art sure no craven. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore, tell me, what in thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore?
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. She was a child, and I was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love. I and my Annabel Lee. With a love that the winged serfs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud by night, chilling my Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I see the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the side of the sea.
Much I marveled at this ungainly fowl to see discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being was ever blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if, in his soul, that one word did he outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of hope his melancholy burden bore.
Nevermore.
very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and the earth. I heard many things. How then am I mad? And observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, just at midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. You would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved in slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he has passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my powers, of my sagacity. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening and the old man sprang up in bed crying, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, In the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening. Presently, I heard a slight groan. I knew it was a groan of mortal terror. It was a low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. He had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but couldn't. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor. Or, it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." He had been trying. He had been trying to comfort himself with suppositions, but found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice on the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single thin ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I saw nothing of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of the drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless and tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, I refrained and kept still. But the beating grew louder and louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now, a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once. Once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night warned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man was absent in the country. I took the visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and decided them here to rest from their fatigues. And in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased. What could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly and more vehemently, yet the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. But it grew louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Almighty God. No. They heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is a beating of his hideous heart.
But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and busted door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy onto fancy, thinking, what of this ominous bird of yore? What this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking? This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet's lining that the lamplights gloated o'er. But whose velvet's violet's lining that the lamplights gloated o'er she shall press? Ah, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed by an unseen censer, swung by a seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch! I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. That it has frequently, very frequently fallen, will scarcely be denied by those who think the boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where one ends and where the other begins? We know that there are diseases in which occur total cessations of all apparent functions of vitality, and yet in which these cessations are merely suspensions. The well-known occurrence of such cases of suspended animation must naturally give rise to premature interments. We have direct testimony of medical experience to prove that a vast number of such cases have actually taken place. I might refer at once, if necessary, to 100 well-authenticated instances. One very well-known case occurred not very long ago in the city of Baltimore. The wife of a respectable citizen, a lawyer of eminence, and a member of Congress, was seized with a sudden and unexplainable illness. After much suffering, she died, or was supposed to die. No one suspected that she was actually not dead. The funeral, in short, was hastened on account of what was supposed to be decomposition. The lady was deposited in her vault, which for 3 subsequent years remained undisturbed. At the expiration of this term, it was opened for the reception of a sarcophagus. But alas, how fearful a shock awaited the husband, who personally threw open the door. As its portals swung outwardly back, some white apparelled object fell, rattling, within his arms. It was the skeleton of his wife, in her yet unmolded shroud. A careful investigation rendered it evident that she had revived within 2 days after her entombment, that her struggles within the coffin had caused it to fall to the floor, where it was so broken as to permit her escape. On the steps which led to the dread chamber, a large fragment of the coffin was found, with which she had endeavored to arrest attention by striking the iron door. While thus occupied, she probably died through sheer terror, and, in falling, her shroud became entangled in some ironwork. Thus she remained, and thus she rotted, erect. What I have now to tell you is of my own actual knowledge, my own positive and personal experience. For several years, I had been subject to attacks of a disorder which physicians term catalepsy. Sometimes the patient lies, for a day only or a shorter period, in a species of exaggerated lethargy. Very usually, she is saved from premature interment solely by the knowledge of her friends that she had been previously subject to catalepsy. The unfortunate whose attack should be of the extreme would almost inevitably be consigned alive to the tomb. My own case differed in no manner from those mentioned in medical textbooks. Sometimes, without any apparent cause, I would sink, little by little, into a condition without pain, without the ability to stir or to think, but with a dull, lethargic consciousness of life and of the presence of those who surrounded my bed. I remained thus until the crisis of my disease restored me, suddenly, to perfect sensation. At other times, I grew sick and numb and chilly and dizzy, and so fell prostrate at once. Then for weeks, all was void and black and silent, and nothing became the universe. Apart from this tendency to trance, however, my general health appeared to be good. In all that I endured, there was no physical suffering, but of moral distress and infinitude. My fancy grew charnel. I talked of worms, of tombs and epitaphs. I was lost in the reveries of death, and the idea of a premature burial held continual possession of my brain. The ghastly danger to which I was subjected to haunted me day and night. It was with struggle that I consented to sleep, for I shuddered to reflect that upon awakening, I might find myself the tenant of a grave. From my innumerable dream images of gloom, I select but one solitary vision. Methought I was immersed in a cataleptic trance, longer than usual. Suddenly, there came an icy hand upon my forehead, and an impatient, gibbering voice whispered the word, "Arise!" within my ear. I sat erect. The darkness was total. I could not see the figure who had aroused me. I could call to mind neither the period at which I had fallen into the trance, nor the locality in which I then lay. While I remained motionless, the cold hand grasped me fiercely by the wrist, shaking it petulantly, while the gibbering voice said again, "Arise! Did I not bid thee arise?" "And who," I demanded, "art thou?" "I have no name in the regions which I inhabit," replied the voice mournfully. "I was mortal, but am fiend. I was merciless, but am pitiful. How canst thou tranquilly sleep? I cannot rest for the cries of these great agonies. Get thee up. Come with me into the outer night, and let me unfold to thee the graves. Is this not a spectacle of woe? Behold!" I looked, and the unseen figure, which still grasped me by the wrist, had caused to be thrown open the graves of all mankind, and from each issued a faint, phosphoric radiance of decay, so that I could see into the innermost recesses and view the shrouded bodies in their sad and sullen slumbers with the worm. Is it not, oh, is it not a pitiful sight? But before I could find the words to reply, the figure had ceased to grasp my wrist, the phosphoric lights expired, and the graves closed with a sudden violence, while from out them arose a tumult of despairing cries. Is it not, oh God, is it not a very pitiful sight? Fantasies such as this extended their terrific influence far into my waking hours. My nerves became thoroughly unstrung, and I fell prey to perpetual horror. I no longer dared trust myself out of the immediate presence of those who were aware of my proneness to catalepsy, lest, falling into one of my usual fits, I should be buried before my real condition could be ascertained. I dreaded that, in some trance of more than customary duration, some may be prevailed upon to regard me as irrecoverable. I exacted the most sacred oath from friends that under no circumstances they would bury me until decomposition had so materially advanced as to render further preservation impossible. I entered a series of elaborate precautions. Among other things, I had the family vault so remodeled as to be readily opened from within. The slightest pressure upon a long lever which extended far into the tomb would cause the iron portal to fly back. There were arrangements for free admission of air and light, and convenient receptacles for food and water within immediate reach of the coffin intended for my reception. The coffin was warmly and softly padded, and provided with a lid with the addition of springs so that the feeblest movements of the body would be sufficient to open it. Besides all this, there was, suspended from the roof of the tomb, a large bell, the rope of which would extend through a hole in the coffin, and so be fastened to one of the hands of the corpse. But not even these well-contrived securities sufficed to save me from the uttermost agonies of living inhumation. There arrived an epoch, as often before there had arrived, in which I found myself emerging from total unconsciousness into the first feeble and indefinite sense of existence. Slowly I approached the faint grey dawn of the cycle day, no care, no hope, no effort. Then, after a long interval, a slight ringing in the ears. After a lapse still longer, a prickling or tingling sensation in the extremities. At length, the slight quivering of an eyelid, and immediately thereupon, an electric shock of terror, deadly and indefinite. Then, the first positive effort to think, and now the first endeavor to remember, and now memory has so far regained its dominion that I am cognizant of my state. I feel that I am not awakening from ordinary sleep. I recollect that I have been subject to catalepsy. And now, at last, my shuddering spirit is overwhelmed by the one grim danger, by the one spectral and ever-prevalent idea. For some minutes after this fancy possessed me, I remained without motion. And why? I could not summon the courage to move. Despair then alone urged me to uplift my heavy eyelids. I uplifted them. It was dark, all dark. I knew that the fit was over. I knew that the crisis of my disorder had passed. I knew that I had fully recovered the use of my visual faculties, and yet it was dark, all dark. The intense and utter raylessness of the night that endureth forevermore. I endeavored to shriek, and my lips and my parched tongue moved convulsively together in the attempt, yet no voice issued from the cavernous lungs. The movement of the jaws in this attempt to cry aloud showed me that they were bound up, as is usual with the dead. I felt too that I lay upon some hard substance, and by something similar my sides were also closely compressed. So far, I had not ventured to stir any of my limbs, yet now I violently threw up my arms, which had been lying at length with the wrists crossed. They struck a solid wooden substance at an elevation of not more than 6 inches from my face. I could no longer doubt that I had reposed within a coffin at last. And now, amid all my infinite miseries, came sweetly the share of hope. For I thought of my precautions. I writhed and made spasmodic exertions to force open the lid, but it would not move. I felt my wrists for the bell rope. It was not to be found. And now the comforter fled forever, and the still sterner despair reigned triumphant, for I could not help perceiving the absence of the paddings I had so carefully prepared. And then, too, came suddenly to my nostrils the strong, peculiar odor of moist earth. The conclusion was irresistible. I was not within the vault. I had fallen into a trance while away from home, while among strangers who had buried me as a dog, nailed me in a coffin, and thrust me deep, deep and forever into some ordinary and nameless grave. As this awful conviction forced itself thus into the innermost chambers of my soul, I struggled to cry aloud, and in this second endeavor I succeeded. A long, wild, continuous shriek or yell of agony resounded through the realms of the subterranean night. "Hello there," said a gruff voice in reply. "What the devil's the matter now?" said a second. "Get out of that," yelled a third. "What do you mean by yowling like a wildcat?" said a fourth, and hereupon I was seized and shaken without ceremony for several minutes. They did not arouse me from my slumber, for I was wide awake when I screamed, but they restored me to full possession of my memory. This adventure occurred near Richmond, in Virginia. Accompanied by a friend, I had proceeded upon a boating expedition some miles down the bank of the James River. Night approached, and we soon found ourselves overtaken by a storm. The cabin of a small sloop offered us the only available shelter. We made the best of it. I slept in one of the only 2 berths available on the vessel. I slept soundly, and the whole of my vision, for it was no dream and no nightmare, arose naturally from the circumstances of my position. The men who shook me were crew of the sloop and some laborers engaged to unload it. From the load itself came the earthly smell, and the bandage about my jaws was a silk handkerchief with which I had bound about my head in absence of a customary nightcap. The tortures endured, however, were quite equal to those of actual burial. They were inconceivably hideous, but from out of evil proceeded good. For their very excess wrought my spirit in inevitable revulsion. I went abroad, I took vigorous exercise, I breathed the free air of heaven. I discarded my medical books. In short, I became a new person. From that memorable night, I dismissed forever my charnel apprehensions, and with them vanished the cataleptic disorder, of which they had perhaps been less the consequence than the cause. There are moments when even to the sober eye of reason, the world of our sad humanity may assume the semblance of a hell. But alas, to be buried while alive is beyond question the most terrific of extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, by this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me, truly I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell the soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a saintly maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Be that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend," I shrieked, upstarting. "Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no plume as a token of the lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door."
Quoth the raven, "Nevermore."
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with the solution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric and august taste. A lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts, leaving neither means of ingress nor egress. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatory, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or the 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the imperial suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange. The fifth with white. The sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions. When the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decor of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There were some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him, to know that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasms. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. These apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. There were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation, but the figure in question had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. The whole company, indeed, seemed now to deeply feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse, and yet all this might have been endured if not approved by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with a deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who would put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person. The vast assembly shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls. He made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first. Through the blue room to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on the account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in an unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with the last of the gay, and the flames of the candelabras expired, and darkness and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies on the floor, shall be lifted.
Nevermore.